Josh Pauling, thank you for joining me on A Commitment to Reality.
Hey, Dave. Great to be with you. Thank you.
I'd like to begin the podcast the same way that you began the book. You quote Wendell Berry. You say, "It is easy for me to imagine that the next great division of the world will be between people who wish to live as creatures and people who wish to live as machines." I think about that a lot. I think that we are at an inflection point in human history. And one of the reasons I think about it a lot is I wonder, am I being alarmist or am I living in reality? And that's one of the reasons that I became convinced that the need for a podcast like this, where we consistently talk about making a commitment to reality, is important. And as I was thinking about it, I started to think about the old joke about a man at a party. And he's talking to a woman and he says, "Hey, would you sleep with me for $1 million?" And the woman says, "For $1 million, I think I would." And he says, "Okay, what about 50?" And she says, "$50? What kind of a woman do you think I am?" He says, "Well, we've already established that. Now we're just haggling over the price." And I think, that's a joke, but it could also act as a parable for our principles.
Mm,
And when we cease being committed to something, it's almost as though we become commodified to
right.
when it comes to the practices that we really commit ourselves to. And I wonder if, for the sake of efficiency, for the sake of progress, money, have we done that when it comes to reality and our humanity? I mean, your book is called Are We All Cyborgs Now? Reclaiming Our Humanity from the Machine. Have we done that to reality?
That's a great opener. I really like that. And I think in some ways we have already made that bargain. And it's not a coincidence that many of the philosophers of technology have referred to technological trade offs as a Faustian bargain,
Mm.
as a deal where we sort of sell our soul to the devil in exchange for efficiency, productivity, measurability, quantification, things like that, right? I think that's really the question we need to be asking. Have we already crossed that threshold into viewing ourselves as machines and treating others as machines or objects? As you said, we tend to commodify ourselves. So yeah, I really like that as a starting point, a launching off point, and that's really where we start the book. Like I said, have we already sort of crept into a cyborg existence? We call it the cyborg creep, right? Where it just sort of little by little, like you said, haggling over price now, right? In the joke you gave, that creep has already sort of started, right? And it's underway, whether we have a chip in our brain, right? Whether we've actually literally merged with technology or not. Living in the digital age, it's so easy just to creep into that cyborg mindset and to really live through our machines in a way that in prior eras wasn't possible.
Yeah. There's also a part where you talk about how AI sentience, we're all so fascinated or concerned or intrigued, whatever word you want to use, with, let's take ChatGPT and all of these large language models. Do they pass the Turing test? Like, are
Mhm,
they conscious? Do they have sentience?
mhm.
And I think that you made a really important distinction that that's a distraction. The real question isn't whether machines can think, but what about when humans start living like machines?
Mhm. Yeah, and this is not a new question. This is one that we draw on a lot of philosophers of technology in the book. And one of the stories I love the best is from Joseph Weizenbaum in the 60s, a MIT professor who was on the front edge of computer science and artificial intelligence as that was really emerging as a movement in the 50s and 60s. And he created what many have called the first chatbot, a program called Eliza, which could simulate human conversation in sort of a psychiatrist type setting. And he had people testing it at MIT, and including his secretary. And at one point, his secretary asked him to leave the room so that she could continue her conversation with Eliza. And Weizenbaum really just became so distraught over what was happening with this very basic chatbot program. People were humanizing it, right? And so he really became a canary in the coal mine, wrote a great book called Computer Power and Human Reason, in which he lays out his argument that we need to stop using this machine template to think about ourselves, because just as you said, we end up humanizing our machines and mechanizing ourselves, right? And so he really is one of the key figures we use in the book, and he has a lot to offer in his way of thinking about this, from being on the front lines of this AI movement, if we could call it that, as it emerged, to becoming one of the prophets of warning about what would happen as we continually sort of think of ourselves through the machine template. And you got to remember, he's doing this in the 60s, long before we all carried around a supercomputer in our pocket, right? Long before these large language models had the capabilities they have today. But the same basic problem remains.
Yeah. And I mean, even since you wrote this book, I mean, when was it officially
Hmm.
published?
August of 24.
So it's old news by this point. I mean, just think about everything that you discussed in the book and how much the technological world has already changed in less than
Yeah.
2 years. I mean, is this something that you're keeping up with, or
Sure. Obviously, for the book, Robin, my co-author Robin Phillips, and I were very much keeping up with this day to day. All the new articles that are coming out. We've continued to stay up as much as we can, but it's also important to take a little break from that type of intense research. And really, it's easy to get consumed by these topics, and something that we want to try to avoid, especially with the themes we're writing about. So yeah, we've kept up with them closely, and it's been interesting to see what's happened since the book, for sure. When we wrote the book, the latest model was ChatGPT 4.0 that had just been released. And that O stands for Omni, which I think is a pretty telling thing, especially in the book, we refer to digital devices as Omni tools, as things that can do way more than prior technologies and tools could, which were tended to be single use tools, right? Static things, whereas digital devices tend to be much more dynamic, which also has effects on how they impact us. So yeah, lots has changed since the book, but the way we frame the book is that, look, we want to provide a framework for thinking about these things that will stand the test of time. And I think
absolutely?
the framework is holding up well. And a lot of the things that we were sort of warning about and wagering on are coming to the fore, I think, and coming to fruition. Of course, we'll be wrong on some matters, but the overriding thing is the framework, right? How do we think about these technological questions? Because what's not going to change is our humanity, our understanding of what it means to be a human, our understanding of God and the world. And if we can ground the discussions there, then, a book will be durable and be able to handle whatever comes in the tech future.
The book is incredible. It's like a field guide to working through these issues because, in a lot of ways, you point to the past.
Right.
And we'll get to that as we go forward. But you talk about this technology and how it's changing and how it's an omni tool, how it's so
Hmm.
much different than prior versions of technology that our world came into contact with. How is this digitization omni tool? How is it different? How is it a reality mediating mechanism, as you call it?
Yeah, great question. People will say, "Well, we've had technological changes before. Isn't this just, the same thing basically?" And I understand the point, but I really think it's a fairly shallow perspective, and one that we can push back on in several areas. For one, as I've already sort of hinted at, prior technologies tended to be static in their use and tended to be very mechanical and observable, intuitive, right, by nature. Think of technologies of the Industrial Revolution. You have gears and pulleys and levers, and you can sort of see how those things work. Digital technologies are hidden. They're obscured in zeros and ones. They're almost like magic. And many philosophers of technology have pointed this out, that when technology gets sufficiently complex, it's really indistinguishable from magic. Very few of us know how our smartphone works. We can't really peel back the layers in a way that's easy to understand. Prior technologies, you could do that in an easier way. Also, prior technologies tended to still involve the body in a more central way. I think of tools in a workshop or even a car. You still traditionally have had to engage your body with the car, use your feet for the brakes and use your hand with the steering wheel and so forth, right? Digital technologies are disembodying by their very nature. They are by sort of default separating you from your body, or allowing your ideas, your voice, your image to transport itself beyond your bodily presence. So that's different. And then perhaps the biggest difference, they go with us everywhere. They're ubiquitous. When I'm done using a hammer in my workshop to make furniture or a saw or chisel or even a table saw, right, an electrified tool, it stays there. And I put the tool down or I leave the tool. The digital goes with us and it talks back. in a way that prior technologies don't. And those types of things have huge effects on our attention, our desires, and are really designed purposefully, right? This is called persuasive design by Silicon Valley, right? I call it attention hacking. My hammer isn't designed with persuasive design to sort of hack my attention, right? It's designed for a specific task, and then I put it down and I'm done.
Mhm.
Digital devices are not that way. So we need to really recognize that to start with, that these things are different. Whether they're categorically different or not, we could have an argument about, but certainly they're significantly different and have many more effects on our human capacities and abilities.
So you just hinted at something, and I think if it's not the first chapter in the book that you wrote, it's very near to it.
Hmm.
And I have to be honest with you. When I got to it, I pick up this book. I was so excited when I got it. When Robin sent it over, I was like, "Oh, I can't wait to dive into this." And I opened the book, and it starts with a chapter by you on woodworking. And I thought, I feel like I have to read it because it's the first chapter, but I don't want to. This doesn't sound interesting. This doesn't sound relevant. And yet, you couldn't have set the stage for the issue in a better way. What has woodworking taught you about reality and the importance of being embodied?
I use that chapter as a launching off point just to reconnect us to what it means to be embodied beings, right? And to bump up against the limits of reality through a trade. You know, for me, it's woodworking. For other people, it might be exercise, right? There's all sorts of ways that we bump up against the limits of reality. And if we don't do that, we start to have a false idea of ourselves and our autonomy and our control and and I already said sort of the disembodied way we think about ourselves in the digital world. So woodworking also bumps up against technological questions. Like I can choose to use hand tools or I can choose to use power tools. When I use hand tools, I'm oriented to the work differently than I am when I use power tools. If I'm using hand planes to flatten stock, then I need to pay attention to the grain. I need to almost get in a state of flow, as many people call it, when I'm planing the wood and sort of getting into a rhythm with my body and listening with my ears to the hand plane and the noise it's making over the wood. And I'm feeling with my hands any rough spots, sort of chatter, it's called, where the plane gets stuck. That creates a whole sense of engagement with my process, sort of a relationship to the wood that we might even say is intimate to a certain degree. When I use a power tool like a planer to surface wood, I plug it in, I hit the button, and I set the depth and I run it through. And that's amazing. It's an amazing technology, and I use it. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't orient me differently to the work. I don't have to pay attention to the grain. I just push it on through. And when I'm making big woodworking projects, I'm very glad I have the planer because it speeds up, my ability to actually turn a profit. But that type of technological dilemma we have all over our lives, right? Maybe another good way to think about it would be a guy who goes to the forest with an axe to cut down trees and clear the forest versus a guy who goes with a bulldozer and a logging truck, right? That different tool, that different technology that he's bringing with him is going to orient him to the forest differently. It's going to be much easier to clear cut the forest with a bulldozer and a logging truck. He might be a little more careful with the axe because it takes much more sweat and labor, physical labor, in the process of chopping down trees. So with that then in mind, then we can launch off into the digital world, right? What are the trade-offs? How are digital technologies orienting me to the world? And even to my perception of myself, right? The amount of power I have over nature and over reality, things like that.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, it leads us into a Gnostic like disembodied state. I mean, where we're
That's right.
constantly, we're stuck between our ears. Everything
Hmm.
is, James K. Smith says, I quote him all the time when it comes to
Hmm.
this, we've become heads on sticks. And this is in every realm. I mean, unfortunately, it creeps into theology, but
And worship practices. Yep. It's all related.
absolutely. Oh, we're getting there later. Trust me. But how did our body become the enemy of the story? I mean, it really feels like in our modern era, we're trying to supersede our physical nature. I mean, how did our physical body become the antagonist of our tale?
Oh, that's a great question. And we could give a long answer for this for sure, but I'll try to hit on some highlights. I think it's going to include the history of ideas and philosophy, right? Sort of an intellectual history, but it's also going to be a history of our material environments, our inventions, our habits, our technologies. And those two things interplay and interrelate to create what Charles Taylor calls a social imaginary, or Peter Berger calls plausibility structures. So our ideas and our material culture together make things seem right, make things seem possible. make things seem desirable. So if we just highlight a few things along the way in the realm of ideas, we do have some antipathy to the body in ancient philosophy, certain strains of Greek thought or Gnosticism and things like that, where the body is seen as really the enemy, something to transcend and get out of, sort of the prison house of the soul. And of course, that's not in all Greek philosophy. I don't want to simplify things there, but there are some strains where the body, there's an antipathy to the body. So that would be one aspect. Then we could speed up to the Enlightenment and see a thinker like Descartes, I think, therefore I am, where again, sort of that brain on a stick mentality really creeps in further. Those would again, just be a few highlights along the way in the realm of ideas. Maybe let's take a minute and talk about the material side, though, when it comes to material environments and inventions. If we think about the development of technologies over time, in many ways, they have increased our power over nature, and in some ways made physical strength less important to survival. And by doing that, that changes the way you think about your relationship to the world. The classic example is to compare a medieval person to a modern person. The medieval person's experience of nature and bumping up against the limits of reality, and then comparing that to a modern person. So medieval person's experience of the weather is going to be much more primal, if I could put it that way. You're going to experience the ups and downs of temperature in ways that we don't today, because we've insulated ourselves from that in homes and in cars and all sorts of things. And that weather is not only going to be physically felt, but it's going to have a huge impact on your livelihood as a medieval person. If there's a famine, well, then there go your crops. So you were much more dependent on natural rhythms and natural forces. And that oriented you to the world as a creature of God. Now, just fast forward to today, modern person, we insulate ourselves from the weather, as we already said, in highly insulated homes. And when we want to get warm or stay cool, we just push a button on the AC unit or maybe on our phone. We just slide or tap and change the temperature in our home. To stay warm in medieval times, you had a lot more labor to do, right? You had to chop the wood, you had to light the fire and deal with the consequences of that in your home or your small shed, basically, whatever you were living in. Now we could go on. Transportation. The medieval person was bound to his local community. We have cars and planes, right? Things that allow us to transcend our location in ways that prior generations didn't. And again, that changes the way we think about ourselves, the world, and even God.
Mm-hmm.
The medieval person, it was easier for them to view themselves as a creature that was embedded in a community, that was bound to other people in ways that we don't, right? We think of ourselves as autonomous, right? In control and not as creatures, right? But as really self-creators. So that would be a short answer to your question. I know we could go on and on there, but I don't know if you have any rabbit trails you want to run down there.
Oh, there's so many. Preparing for this conversation was difficult because the book, it's just so rich and so deep, and there's so many tributaries that you could go down.
That's sort of the point of the book, is to bring an interdisciplinary approach and to show how all these things are connected. That's where a lot of books on these topics sort of focus on one aspect. We wanted to show how this really relates to everything.
It really functions as a field guide to reality. And how you can commit to it in a sense, not to just go back to the theme of the podcast over and over. But I mean, there's so much in here. And one of the things that really caught me was your personal practices and how they create freedom for you to live an embodied life. One, you say you don't have internet at home.
So this has been really a long-term commitment for me and my family. So right now I'm not at home. We're doing this from church where I work. And when I was a teacher for many years, that was our practice as well, to not have internet at home. So when we need to do things on the internet for many years, while my wife and I still had flip phones, is we basically jot down a list of things that we'd want to do on the internet. We'd go to the library, or I'd do it at school and then print out things to do at home or whatever. So that's been our approach for a long time. We do have smartphones now, I admit. I've had a smartphone since COVID, I guess it was, maybe a little bit before. My wife and I did get smartphones at that point. But I will say, man, you can see its effects. Even when you know what it does, it's just so hard, attention spans and things. It just becomes the default thing to do. We're actually thinking about purchasing one of these newer options that have emerged, where trying to sort of return to sort of a dumb phone. There's a lot of good options out there for folks in this realm: the light phone, the wise phone, Punked. There's a whole bunch of companies that are trying to provide a product that allows you to return the phone to the tool lane, right, rather than the omni tool lane. But that could be a whole other rabbit trail there. So now when we need the internet we can hotspot our phones, but even that is a barrier to entry, a small barrier. The computer's default setting is that it's off in our home and it's not connected to the internet. So if we need to do something with the computer, then we open the computer and turn it on. If we need to use the internet, then we would hotspot our phone and connect our laptop to the phone. So I do have access to the internet at home now when I need it. But again, I think it's important to have some barriers to entry for people. This is just a classic strategy of habits and habit formation. James Clear talks about this in Atomic Habits. The things you want to create for good habits, you want to lower the barrier of entry towards, and things that you want to avoid or eliminate, you raise the barrier to entry to. So that's a way we do that with relation to the internet. We just raise the barrier a little bit. We make it harder to enter that realm, and
Hmm.
we make things that we want to do, right, better things, easier to enter. And that principle just translates all over the place. In the home, where do you keep your devices? Are there parts of your home that you don't allow them to go? What default activities do you want you and your children to do? What should it be easier to turn on, right? Should it be easier to turn on the TV or a device, or should it be easier to play board games, right? Or read books or play the piano, those types of things.
The word that keeps coming through my mind as you're talking is just intentionality. I
That's
mean,
exactly right.
really, like being intentional with your lives because with the phone, I mean, how many times have you heard somebody say, "Oh, I picked up my phone and an hour later I was still just sitting there scrolling through." I mean,
We
it's
just get steamrolled. It's not a matter of willpower, right? These things are designed purposefully to hack our attention, right? They're dopamine
well,
dispensers. And all
and
of that, then it's a pull. Peter Limburger talks about it as a gravitational pull. To fight that, the first thing is, again, to be intentional, to realize that it's a battle, and then to structure your life in such a way that you can nudge yourself to better things, right? And resist the nudges of the device. Yeah, intentionality is so key here. And the way we mostly orient to technology is we just go along with it. That's sort
yeah,
of our default
we're
setting.
along for the
Technology equals
ride.
progress. Newest is the greatest, latest is greatest. If we can do something technologically, we should. It's called the technological imperative. We totally need to push back on that and really develop a personal philosophy of technology. Newport talks about this in Digital Minimalism. That's the first step, to realize the problem and develop a personal philosophy of technology and intentional relationship to your devices that then allows you to have freedom.
Well, it's so interesting because I mean, you talked about how your students, when you used to teach, would find out that you didn't have internet and they think, "Oh, you're like prehistoric." But even as I read it, I had that reaction like, "Oh man, that would be so difficult." And before I got married, I was a vagabond. I mean, people use that term.
Mhm.
I was a real, I mean, I lived all over the world. I would just find work. And up until I got married, I never had a TV in the home. I was like you. I was a very late adopter to the smartphone world. At one point, I didn't even have a phone. I don't even, I think about it. I constantly think about this. Even just getting from point A to point B. How did we do that before we had GPS? I mean, we clearly did, but I don't remember. And I'm thinking about my own life and historically I was able to do this because I was very intentional about what I wanted out of life. I didn't want to sit at home and watch TV. If I was at home, I would read, but a lot of the time I was just traveling and I was out there experiencing the world. And so if I have a hard time grasping, the idea of being intentional because we think, man, that's going to be really hard. Just think about how inconvenient that's going to be. Just think about the lack of efficiency that we're going to have in our household if we don't have these things.
Yeah, yeah.
And I told you the woodworking chapter, it happened again. You just had this penchant for writing these chapters that I got there and I thought, all right, this is a book on technology. Why do I want to learn about the Amish or the Luddites? I mean, Luddites, they're the fools, right? And yet I was captivated. I mean, I told my wife, I was like, I kind of just want to talk to him about the Amish because we, as technology keeps coming out, like I think you called it the technological imperative, like if we just have to go along with progress. I mean, we're in this rapidly flowing river and we don't know what to do. And we feel like if we don't go along, now there's the macro, if we don't go along, I mean, everybody's scared of AI and feels like we should put limits on this. But if we don't, they will. That's the macro if you're talking about countries. But then there's even just the issue of businesses. If we don't adapt, we're going to get left behind. And then it goes down to families. communities, individuals. If I don't, I'm going to get left behind. And I always, over the past several years, I say, we're going to become Amish if we don't do this. And I said that as a negative. But I mean, is there a sense that the Amish have this right?
It's a great question. Yes and no. I think there are aspects of the Amish that are very admirable and that we should learn from for sure. And that's the point of the chapter when it comes to the Amish and the Luddites. And just sort of as a side note, Amish communities are actually growing and exploding at rates that are pretty astounding. They're spreading into new states and all sorts of things. 21st century might be the revenge of the Amish. Who knows? You heard it here first. No, the things that I love about the Amish. I went to a college in a portion of Pennsylvania that had some sort of Amish roots and Mennonite Brethren roots, and some of the professors really did a ton of research in this area and published books. And that was sort of my first exposure as a sort of a teen to this world and their way of thinking. And then when I went to grad school, I had another professor who would go and visit Amish communities and do a lot of research that way. So that was sort of my gateway into thinking about this. And I've continued to be fascinated by these communities and especially their approach to technology. Now, it's easy to think that, oh, they're anti-tech, right? But it's a much more nuanced position, really. They embrace certain technologies, and they're even willing to use certain mechanized things, just that aren't necessarily connected to the electrical grid, right? A lot of times they'll, for example, the woodworking world that I live in, they'll use mechanized woodworking tools. They just won't use them in their electric form, right? They'll run them on like compressed air or something like that. There's actually folks that convert woodworking equipment to be Amish friendly, from running on electric motors to running on compressed air and things like that. So they use technologies, but the questions they ask about technologies are ones we should ask. What is this going to do to the community? What is this going to do to the sacred precincts of the home? And what is this going to do to me?
Mhm.
And those types of basic questions are just common sense questions, a great sort of diagnostic set of questions to ask. In one of the books I read for that chapter in preparing, there was a bunch of people that were visiting, like, I can't remember if it was an Amish, like furniture factory or something, but some type of tour setting, right? And the guide said, how many of you watch too much TV? And how many of you use your phone too much? And everybody's hand went up, right? How many of you would like to do something about that, right? And change your relationship to all these devices? Everybody's hands. Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. And then the guy said, we actually do something about it. I think that's just a great way to think about it, right? They don't just complain or bemoan the situation. They've made decisions, very intentional decisions, to craft a different relationship to technology for the sake of their community, for their family, and the passing down of a tradition, right, that they value. And in large part, it works. Their retention rates are much higher than other Christian denominations. Of course, we always hear stories of people that leave Amish communities, right? But the norm is that they stay. What's interesting, though, some of the books that have been written more recently in this field are talking about the impact of the smartphone on Amish communities, because it's much harder to police, because it goes with you in your pocket in a way that these prior technologies that they had questions about did not. So that's going to be interesting to see how even the smartphone might affect Amish communities and is affecting Amish communities. There's a place in Amish communities for communal discernment, right? And that's really important.
There's an interesting distinction, but as with everything, sometimes the smallest distinction makes the biggest difference.
Hmm.
The Amish have access without ownership. So they use
Yes.
cars, but they don't own cars. They'll use
Yes.
phones, let's say, in their business, but they won't bring them into their home. And that
Hmm.
discernment, that distinguishing factor, how important is that? And what can we learn and almost bring in if we're trying to become, somewhat Amish in our own world in terms of trying to embrace the embodiment of our day-to-day life? How can we do that by practicing that discernment? Because on some level, it's almost what you're doing when you choose to have internet in your home via the hotspot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You have the access, but it's not all encompassing ownership. It's not all of the time.
Yeah, that's right. I think it shows us there's a place for nuanced thinking here. It's not like an all or nothing deal, and the Amish model that, and we can too. I can choose to have access to certain technologies, maybe at work or at the library, and maybe not in my home. Those types of things are good creative solutions that allow us to benefit from the goods of these technologies, and also minimize their detrimental effects on me as an individual or for me and my family or on the communal level. I think that's a really good way to think about this. None of us are saying that there's no goods that come from these potential technologies. It's just that we need to recognize the potential detriments and situate them in our lives in ways that allow us hopefully to benefit from the goods and not to be impacted negatively by their detriments.
I have to admit, I only ever used the word Luddite as a slur, and that's the only context that I understood it from. That somebody who's kind of like dull or anti-technology or whatever doesn't want to get with the program when it comes to progress.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until I read your book that I realized that Luddites were actual people in a place and time. Who were the Luddites, and what can we learn from them?
Yeah, so this was a group in England in the Industrial Revolution that were very familiar with technologies. They were using machines in factories. But as certain new industrial technologies emerged, they became concerned about what it was doing to their labor, to their agency, right, to their ability to have control in a certain sense over the product they were making, over their livelihood, and what that was going to do then in impact on their community and on their family. And so what they ended up doing is really resisting the latest technology that was emerging in the factories at the time. And they did become known for smashing some machines. And that's the origin of sort of the Luddite straw man is, oh, these are just people that smash machines and hate technology. But they actually knew how to use many of the machines in the factories. They were very technologically adept, but they also realized where these new technologies were going and what it was going to do to the economy, to the nature of labor. It was going to essentially reduce them to cogs in a machine in the factory. And they were concerned about that then they would become replaceable, that this would have an impact on their income and on their families. And those things drove them to raise serious questions about technological development. So it wasn't again, just like the Amish, it's not an anti-tech approach. It's
Mhm.
asking questions. What is this going to do to the meaning of my labor, the meaning of my life, the way I provide for my family and things like that?
You didn't say this in the book, but as I was thinking about the line of, okay, you've got the Amish, you've got the Luddites. What about monastics? Because monastics practice a lot of the same principles. They kind of assess and they bring some or they don't depending on the circumstance and even probably more so than the Amish because it's not as though they have some sort of ban on the electrical grid. Do you see a connection with the monastics? And is there something as Christians that we could really take and absorb from the monastic influence that has kind of been dormant for a lot of Western Christianity?
Great connection. Absolutely. There's a lot of connections we can make to monasticism here and monastic wisdom. Yeah, right on the money. Very good. There are a few points in the book where we refer to it as technological asceticism, that the decisions we make are a form of asceticism, where we're denying ourselves certain things intentionally. Paul Kingsnorth has talked about this in the terms of being a technological ascetic. So yes, we want to draw on that tradition. We can reclaim the wisdom of the fathers here, the desert fathers, the monastic fathers. There's so much here and we do have some quotes sort of sprinkled throughout the book from some of these folks, especially when they're talking about acedia and sloth,
Mhm.
all right, and some of the seven deadly sins, subduing the passions. We need to train ourselves to do so. And the wisdom of the monastics here is something we can definitely tap and should continue to tap in this age. Yeah, the West, as you said, has especially since the Protestant Reformation, there's been sort of a looking down upon monasticism, and maybe there were some extremes that needed to be addressed. We could have a discussion about that, perhaps, but there's wisdom there in the intentional living and in the seriousness with which the disciplines are approached, and the importance of reordering our desires, right, retraining our desires towards higher ends and permanent things, and that's the type of wisdom we need today. And I think the monastic language also is helpful when we think about the relationship to digital devices that we have. Um, Ian Harbour of Mere Orthodoxy wrote a recent article about this recently. He said, we should have a monks and missionaries approach to the digital age. And I love the way he fleshed this out. And what he said is that most people should be monks when it comes to the digital age. In other words, we should be very intentional about our relationship to the internet, especially social media. And most of us probably don't need to spend a lot of time there, maybe none when it comes to social media. But then he also said there's going to be a missionaries approach too. There are going to be people that devote time and effort to having an intentional relationship to social media, YouTube, things like that, and producing good content and trying to bend this towards better ends. I think that monks and missionaries framework isn't a bad one to think about, right? That we need to have almost a monastic approach to these things, just because they're so alluring and so tempting and designed to be such. But then there's also a place in which we need to be putting good content into this space to bring people out of that space, to show them that there's a better world, a deeper world, another world in which they can sort of learn to grow into. And for many, that we're seeing this unfold in sort of the internet pipeline into Christianity. There's a lot of folks that discover, let's say, a Jordan Peterson or somebody in the manosphere, right? And then they start learning a little bit more about Christianity, and then all of a sudden they show up at a church. We just had a guy this Sunday show up, right? A young man who had been online, right? Who had been going down that pathway, that pipeline, and then all of a sudden he's here. So there is a place for sort of a missional approach to these things as well.
I don't know if it's relevant, but this is the point of a conversation. When you talk about missionary, I think about when I was younger
Hmm.
and I would bring somebody home and I'd talk to my dad afterwards and he'd be like, is she a Christian? How's her faith? So, oh, she's not, but she's interested. And it's the term missionary dating. I'm gonna win her over, not her worldview winning mine over. And my dad, in his paternal wisdom, would always say that rarely works out in the
Yes,
direction that you're intending. It
that's
actually
right.
almost always brings the other person down.
Hmm.
And I think that's relevant when discussing how intentional and careful we have to be, because I sit there and I think, I'll have to admit, even with this podcast, I thought, do we need more noise? Isn't the answer to remove ourselves? But at the same time, I see people coming in the front door of our church every Sunday, and I know that the vast majority of them are finding the church online.
Right.
And so it's kind of walking that narrow path and being
Yes.
extremely careful and discerning and just prayerful the whole time. I mean, maybe you're a
Hmm.
monk and a missionary at the same time, if that's possible, because man, the mediums are so insidious. I mean, the way that they can grab you. Even as I'm working on this podcast, I'm finding myself on social media more
Yeah.
and on the internet more.
Sure.
I've told my wife, I love the conversations. I think they're rich and I think they will help people, but man, do I hate the aspect that encompasses social media and you get stuck in it, even just deploying the things, sending them out into
Sure.
the universe.
Yeah, and you'll have to develop intentional practices and boundaries, right, to make sure that you don't get swallowed up by the machine here either. It's so easy, right, to sort of get sucked up into that influencer mentality or a performative mentality, right? Because as we know, the medium is the message. It nudges us, it forms us and shapes us in a certain direction. So yeah, there's a fine line here that individuals need to navigate, also churches need to navigate. And I think, the way our church has dealt with this is the internet can be a place sort of like the vestibule to the church, perhaps, the narthex to the church. We want to have a footprint online. We want to have good material online, but we certainly don't want to give the impression that one can worship online, that one can
Mhm.
have that sense of what happens on Sunday morning and in the embodied community of the church. You can't replicate that online. And we shouldn't give the impression that we can, right? So, for example, I know this is a bit of a rabbit trail, but we don't live stream our worship services. We record the sermon, the service of the word portion of the service, but we do not record the Eucharist. We don't want to give the impression that one could attempt even to commune from home. We want them to come to partake of these things with us and become part of our community. And with each video we post, we also have like a 1 minute explanation of that ahead of time. Hey, I hope this is a good thing for you to receive. But remember, this isn't the real deal. This is not the embodied community where you're really hearing the living word of Jesus and receiving his living body. That needs to take place in community, in the flesh.
Yeah, no, I mean, church is the embodied alternative. I
That's
mean,
right.
there's so many circumstances where we can sit here and lament the darkness that's approaching, as opposed to building a lighthouse. And yeah, on a podcast that we did years ago, I remember somebody, we kind of teed it up for this, hey, aren't things terrible? And the guest basically said, yes, things are terrible, but we're made for this moment. I mean,
There you
there's
go.
no better opportunity for us as Christians. As the world goes in this direction, we have to be ready to receive people who are going to be hurt by the ramifications of that. And in just the same way, the church is the embodied alternative to a digitized world. And we have to be intentional about how we approach that. As you said,
Hmm.
I mean, you felt like you were going to ruffle feathers when you said, we don't do church online here. And there are some circumstances where somebody might be unable to come, but those are
Sure.
rare.
Right.
And and you can't I mean, you can't allow that option to become the main thing
Right.
because this the church is embodied. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think treating church as education has left us vulnerable to this ideology?
Yeah, that whole brains on a stick thing, right? It comes back to that. If church is just about putting information in your head, essentially a data download, well, you can sort of do that online and probably with better preachers and educators on YouTube. But if Christianity is about much more than information, right? But if it's about the formation of a person and a living encounter with the risen Christ in word and sacrament, well, you cannot replicate that online, right? So I think, yeah, part of the problem is we've really had such a shallow view of what Christian worship is, and also what Christianity is, and it really goes two directions. The one direction is brain on a stick, right? That Christianity is just sort of an intellectual exercise, and the sermon is basically a lecture, and that's what you get at church. You get new information that then you like deploy in your life to be more productive and more efficient. That's one trajectory that's wrong, right? Or not complete, I should say. Then there's also a trajectory where you're like a heart on a stick, right? You're just a bundle of emotions. And what
Mhm.
Christianity is like an emotional high. It's experiential worship. You have these certain feelings about God, and that's incomplete too, right? So what we need is the full thing. We need the embodied worship, which yes, there's information involved, but it's much more than information. It's formation. And there are emotions involved, but there's more than emotions. It's emotions based on truth and goodness and beauty. And that, I would argue, and this would be a different argument, but that historically the church has done in its worship service, which has historically been a pretty liturgical affair with
Mhm.
the embodied practices, kneeling, bowing, crossing yourself, right? You're using your body in worship, eating, right? The Lord's Supper, talking about an embodied thing, hearing with your ears, right? All of your senses are enveloped in the divine service, in the Sunday worship service, and talk about a multimedia experience from God. You don't need PowerPoint projectors. You don't need screens. He's already designed this thing to hit your senses with all of the things that occur in a historic Christian worship service.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about the dangers of missionary dating. Well, that's really what the seeker sensitive movement is. I mean,
Right.
you're trying to adapt the practices of the world to make your church service feel more inviting, to really get reach people where they're at. And as I said, with missionary dating, the missionary is usually the one that falls.
Right.
You know, they lose what made them them. And I remember I went to a church here in Charlotte, and you'd walk in and there's just a really hip art gallery, and it's very well intentioned. I want to be careful when I'm saying this. I'm not saying this as to denigrate them or anything, because everybody, I mean, they're well intentioned
Of course.
and clearly doing good work in the example that I'm giving, where you walk into this art gallery and it's just these beautiful pictures of work that they're doing in the mission field. And then tugs on your heartstrings and you donate there. And then you pour your coffee and you go in and you sit and it feels like you're in a hip coffee shop. Then you got a couple songs, and I remember one of them was a pop song that they were baptizing for use in worship. I mean, it was relevant. I mean, thematically, you could see, okay, yeah, that fits. But it was also, hey, you like the song? We're going to play this here. And then the pastor came out with the wire mic And I remember sitting there thinking, this is just a TED Talk.
That's right.
I mean,
Yeah.
this is, and I eventually left church and then started to go more and more sacramental, liturgical in my leanings. And that's when I started to see the purpose in church a little bit more. Because otherwise, like you said, I can get a better TED Talk online. If all this is about hacking my personhood and
Right. Right.
becoming efficient and better, I can do that somewhere else. I don't need to go to the church for that. They're going to do a worse job than the world at being
Right.
the world.
It's like a party without the beer. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and this again relates to, I think, some of the insights of the philosophers of technology that for a long time have been saying the medium is the message. Form influences content. As Christians, we usually think of content. It's either got to be good content or bad content. We don't think about how the form influences what's being communicated and actually might be more influential in what we take away from things. And that it relates to worship. Form communicates something, right? Everything we do in worship communicates a theological truth or a theological falsehood. And we want to make sure that the medium and the message line up, right? The form and the content align and are saying the same thing about who we are, about who God is, and how God comes to man.
Respectfully, do you think a memorial view of the sacraments has unintentionally made light of our embodiment?
Mm. I do think that a lot of evangelicalism and Protestantism at large ends up in a pretty Gnostic place, a pretty disembodied place. I grew up Baptist and then became Reformed, and now I'm in a more sacramental and liturgical tradition. And so I have much respect for those different traditions and think that we can learn a lot from each other. But I do think there's a tendency in sort of low church traditions to end up denigrating the body. And there's been a lot of research on this. Philip Lee has a great book called Against the Protestant Gnostics from like the 90s, I think. Michael Horton wrote one called In the Face of God, talking about the Gnostic tendencies within evangelicalism. So I do think there's something there. I don't want to overplay that hand and be uncharitable, but I do think that we should be willing to consider how those a memorialist view of the sacrament or some of the other teachings of evangelicalism can nudge us towards disembodiment and really a false view of the body.
Yeah, and I kept thinking about how, we're made to be deified, deification,
Hmm.
union with God.
Yep.
And when we make ourselves nothing more than data processors, we become datafied. And that's the end goal. Can you name that shift? I mean, the importance of that? Where we become just pure exchange of information as opposed to union with God, because it's something that I talk about a lot with friends where I talk about my own church life. I
Hmm.
say orthodoxy small o
Hmm.
only exists for orthopraxy. It's only to guide right worship.
Hmm.
It's not an end to itself. And I think that we've lost our humanity for the sake of greater data processing, because
Hmm.
that's what we've become. It's all just how much information can I accumulate? And you compared it almost to like microplastics or PFAs,
Mm.
and how we aren't made to process this amount of information. And we're all experiencing almost like toxic shock.
The speed at which we can access information, the amount of information we're accessing is just inhuman in its scale. We don't know what to do with it all. And the comparison was then made to the way that plastics are sort of in the environment everywhere, right? And are part of our bodies now in ways that probably will end up being pretty toxic to us. That's sort of our information environment that we live in. It sort of permeates everything. And then that impacts how we think about everything. We want to quantify everything, even ourselves. Everything is measurable. And think about the technologies that allow this. We have Apple Watches that can keep our heart rate and steps and all of those things. There's actually a movement called the quantified self movement, which desires to quantify every aspect of human life, right? To basically become more productive and efficient. And there may be some place for thinking about quantifying some aspects or measuring some aspects of our humanity. But when that becomes the default setting, we really are short circuiting what it means to be human, to use an electrical analogy. And if we think about the way that God comes to man, it's very inefficient. God took on human flesh in one place at one time in Jesus Christ. And To spread his message, he had to walk around and talk to people. He, used spit and mud and touch and words and all of those things to heal. He couldn't simulcast his sermons, right? He couldn't live stream the resurrection. He couldn't use any of the modern communication technologies we have. And that wasn't an accident that God came at that moment. The scriptures talk about this as the kairos moment, the perfect moment for him to come was a time before he could be videotaped, a time before he could post on YouTube. I mean, you could just go on and on with the things that we would think would be efficient or effective in getting the message out. And
Mhm.
instead, it's this embodied, slow, incarnational way of spreading his message. And that is intentional. That's the pattern and the paradigm. The incarnation is the pattern and paradigm for everything. And as you said, that is our ultimate destiny. God became man so that man may become God in properly understood. And that is where we're headed. We're not headed to some mechanized reality or some reality separate from our bodies or some data world that somebody like Yuval Noah Harari wants or something like that. We are destined for an embodied existence in union with God and one another in a new heavens and new earth,
Yeah.
a very embodied, real destiny.
Yeah. But there's no but. I don't want to put a but on that. As I said earlier, I'm constantly trying to understand what reality is right now because we are experiencing, I think, an extreme state of disorientation. And I wonder, am I being alarmist or am I being a realist? Right? When you think about technologies like Neuralink, and yeah, there can be really good implementation of that technology where you get somebody who's locked in and all of a sudden they're engaging the world, right? That's the best case scenario. But there's a lot of slippery slopes there. And I just can't help but I mean, this is where you think about the Amish and you say, "Hey, if you don't do this, we're going to become Amish, intentionally or otherwise." And yet, you just can't help but to ponder constantly in this moment that we're living through, where do we draw the line, right? I mean, you talk about are we all cyborgs now? And as we all exist with this smartphone in our hand, and it's the first thing we grab when we wake up, and the first thing or the last thing we look at before we go to bed. I mean, what's the difference between that and it being implanted? And yet there is a very real thing. And maybe I don't think that I'm living in this science fiction world where I think that's going to be a real thing. And I think that's why you started the book the way that you did with the Wendell Berry quote.
Mhm.
It's a decision that we're going to have to make. Do you see that? Do you feel that as strongly as I do?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And but I will just say with the decisions, you said, well, we pick up the smartphone first at the beginning of the day and last thing we don't have to do that. We can make decisions not to do that. And I think we need to. Uh, lots of books have proposed like practical steps each day. Justin Whitmore Early has a great book called The Common Rule. And one of his rules is scripture before phone uh, each day, right? Scripture before screen, prayer before phone. We shouldn't pick it up first each day and we shouldn't have it in a room at night. So we can make decisions to resist these things. So we could talk about some R's here. One, we need to recognize what the problems are and develop a intentional philosophy of technology. Then we can resist. We can intentionally make decisions that are hard. We can be weird and own it. And Christians always have. And there's something attractive about being weird, actually. My high school students loved it that I was weird. It actually gave me a sense of like credibility with them that I wasn't trying to be cool because I'm not cool. So just own it, right? Own the weirdness. There's a sense in which that actually becomes attractive and almost anticipates the pendulum swing in some ways that's happening. On these technological questions. I collected phones long before in my classroom, long before the anxious generation was suggesting this, right? And now it's like in 20 states. But by being weird, I was already sort of thinking about some of these things. So yeah, be weird and own it. We need to resist. Then we also need to replace and reclaim and recover what's good, true, and beautiful. So
Hmm.
there's a no aspect of this. Yes, we do need to say no to some things. But even more important, it's because there's better things we can say yes to.
Better, yes.
And that's, like you were saying, the Christian response to this moment, we're just made for this moment in so many ways, right? It's not about saying no. It's about we have a better yes. And by saying no to certain things, you give room for that yes. You can reclaim those practices in your home of time together, of true leisure, of reading and playing games and music together. As communities, you can host dances and picnics and hikes. As churches, you can embrace the tables of the Lord, first off the Eucharistic table. And from that table, then community and fellowship flows over into the parish table. And then from the parish table, it flows over into our familial tables in our homes. There's just so much Christianity has to offer this moment. And that's the vision that we need to cast. Not that we're negative Nancy's, but we have something better. I think that's really where we need to end up on these things.
Yeah, next to your better yes that you talk about, I wrote the word hope. And I mean, there are moments when you really think about the extension of how everything could go technologically over the next couple of years. You can start to feel hopeless.
Hmm.
And yet you're better, and that's something that I really appreciate that you guys laid out in the book is the better yes. But really want to drill down on this hopelessness for a second too, because these are real decisions that I think we're going to have to make. And it's kind of like the proverbial lobster in a pot.
Yeah.
We're all so inundated with this technology, and it's such a large part of our lives and our work lives, and it's coming into our churches. How do we do this? I mean, for example, if they start wiring models into human beings, into our actual bodies, so like the Neuralink type of thing. I mean, there's almost going to be the temptation to become two different species in a sense. And how do we resist that? Where do we draw the line? Because I gave the example of Neuralink. If somebody's locked in, that's a very attractive technology. If you can create an artificial organ, all right. If my son needed an artificial organ, I'm getting it, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I love my son. But where do we draw the line? How many organs? Assuming that it's possible. I mean,
Sure.
do you get where I'm going with this?
Of course. Yeah. The realm of bioethics in relation to technological questions is very challenging. And this is where I think we need to really combine the insights of our theologians, our ethicists, our technologists, engineers, and so forth. We need all hands on deck on these questions. But just a couple guiding principles, if I may. One, we need to start from a clear understanding of Christian anthropology. What is a human being? An embodied soul. The unity of body and soul is a human person. And that grounding needs to be right there in the forefront when we're thinking about all these questions. Second off, we want to think about technologies in relation to restoration of human capacities, right? So there's definitely restorative uses of technology and medicine that I think we can embrace as Christians, right? Because of the fall, things are broken, right? And medicine plays a role in restoring some of those things that are broken because of the fall, because of disease and sickness and so forth. But when we start to cross over into enhancement, right?
Hmm.
That's, I think, where we need to be very careful. We will have to draw some hard lines, right? Just like we do on abortion and other matters, right? Which are related to technological questions, right? This is another thing people don't think about. Medicine is technology. The same types of thinking that we have about smartphones, we should be having about medical procedures. And that's going to get more complex to navigate, and that's going to require communal discernment. That's going to require pastoral care. And I would not on a podcast talking to strangers try to offer specific advice, because there's going to be so much individuality on these types of things. But yeah, those would be guiding principles. What is a human being? And then thinking about this in relation to restorative technologies that can probably have a place, but not in the realm of enhancement or body modification or things like that, which we're already seeing in realms that Christians say no to, right? Like transgenderism is body modification, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
It's a technological attempt to change the body to align to who I think I am inside. Let's talk about Gnosticism. And we say no to that. We say no to transhumanism. We say no to attempts to sort of transcend our bodies digitally or technologically. And in a certain sense, you could even say that transgenderism is a subset of transhumanism. So we already, in certain areas, are willing to place some boundaries around things. We will need to continue to do that as these medical dilemmas intensify.
Do you see where I'm going with this though? That especially in connection to the Amish, and that's the reason that I led the whole conversation with that joke or parable, depending on how you want to view it, because there are going to potentially be real stakes. There is going to be
For sure.
a situation where, I mean, we look at the Amish and they live such different lives than we do, where we may, if we're going to truly make a commitment to the reality as we understand it, to an embodied reality, that we're going to be, I
There
hate
will
to
be
use the
costs,
word left
sacrifices.
behind, but there will be cost. There will be sacrifices. I mean, am I being alarmist, or do you see that on the forefront?
I think it's possible. I do. I don't want to get apocalyptic or too pessimistic. I try to be a tech realist, not a tech optimist or a tech pessimist. But I do think that we need to be talking honestly with people about the hard choices that we need to be making for the good of ourselves and the good of our children and the good of our communities. What that exactly looks like, I'm not going to attempt to predict because things change so quickly. I mean, even in the realm of LLMs, there's been a huge cooling on that in the last few months. Investment is starting to dry up. Some people are calling it a bubble. ChatGPT was 5 was a huge disappointment as far as capabilities. We can't predict exactly what the future is going to look like, but yes, difficult decisions need to be made now, and will continue to need to be made.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about for your children, and I think that so many people view the doing what's right for your children as an economic investment to set them up for economic success. And I do think that we are going to have to make a real intentional distinction between their the success of their soul, and how that might look different if there is, in my, let's call it, apocalyptic worldview. And it's not a worldview, it's more just a pondering. I think that could things go this direction, and if they do, what do we do? And as we talked about before, I mean, what do we do? Every time I go into church and I touch the physical walls, I kind of joke, but I mean it. This is like when we played tag as kids and you had a home base.
Hmm.
And whenever I enter into the church and touch those walls, the physical walls of the temple, say, you can't hurt me here. This is home base. And I think, to answer my own question in a sense, I mean, that's what we need to do, is that we need to retreat not from the world, but into the temple, into the home base, and just really commit ourselves to that reality of the incarnation, right?
Yeah. That's right. And then that empowers us and enables us and sustains us to face whatever comes. So, yeah, there's going to need to be more intentional communal decisions. There's going to need to be coming together of churches and families to support each other on these things. It's really a collective action problem in some ways, because if just one person makes a change on these things, it's very hard to see the benefits. But if a group of people come together, say in a church or a community or a school, and agree to make certain decisions about technologies, then you start to really see the benefits. It's sort of like a synergy that occurs between the people. So yeah, I'm right there with you. The place to really resist this is in the church, and then that flows out into the home, and then into sort of small little platoons, as Edmund Burke called them. This is what the church knows how to do, and has been doing for a long time. And I think in some ways, honestly, that type of intentional raising of children or raising of the next generation in the human things and in the permanent things actually ends up being best preparation for service to the world as well. And actually might have some economic benefits in the long run, right? I know we don't make decisions based on pragmatic calculations or utilitarianism, but ironically, it turns out that what's going to be most relevant in the workplace is people that actually know how to think and know how to write and communicate without outsourcing everything to AI. So I think in the long run, we're actually going to be doing everybody a service by resisting the sort of infiltration of the machine into everything.
Well, it's hope. And you talk about like the straight stick versus the crooked stick, and the straight stick actually helps you see where the imperfections lie. It's the same thing that I think has been happening with a lot of traditional churches. Let's like call them high churches, sacramental liturgical churches are experiencing an influx. And I think a lot of that stems from when anything goes in the world, the last true rebellion, as they call it, is to limit yourself and to actually embrace some sort of asceticism, to really free yourself from the passions. And I think it took the world going to an extreme for people to come back to the church, to see that as the more attractive thing. And so you are providing hope in that sense, and that we just have to keep doing what we do. And like I said, we're made for the moment. The church is the best alternative here. We just have to be ready when they come. You provide a lot of invitations to hope when you say you have the better yes. One of them is the joy of thingness. What is the joy of thingness?
Yeah, this is the fact that there's something really cool about physical things, and we're made to enjoy those physical things, whether it's natural things or whether it's even man-made things, things that we do as sort of sub-creators, as Tolkien called us. We are creators by nature. We're in the image of the divine creator. So to be able to enjoy a guitar and the thingness of a guitar, its wooden body and its metal strings and the frets and how all those things work together with you and your body to create music. That's the joy of thingness. Using a hand plane is the joy of thingness. Going out in nature and attuning yourself to the environment and watching birds is the joy of thingness. Taking in the sunshine. I mean, we could just go on and on. Anything that involves our bodily senses in real time and real space are ways that we can sort of reconnect to that joy of what it means to be human and the joy of enjoying objects and
Josh,
things that are made by God and subcreated by us.
you said to hear the birds, and this morning I went for a run. And usually when I go for a run, I changed one thing. So before, you want to talk about like quantification and the problem that it
Yeah, yeah,
pertains to? I used to not run. If I couldn't find like my headphones and everything, all of the accoutrement, I
yeah,
wouldn't go for a run.
yeah,
Or
yeah,
I remember one time I couldn't get my, Strava or Nike Run Club or whatever app to work, and I didn't go for the run. Because in my mind, if I can't quantify it, it's not worth
yeah,
doing. If I
yeah,
can't track it, it's not worth doing. And I would get done with running. I'm a big runner, and oh man, I thought did a way better run than that. It's the same thing with the sleep trackers. I thought I slept well. This says I didn't.
yeah.
And how much of a creep that can become. But even this morning, because I wanted to prepare for our conversation, I said, I'm going to run without
Nice.
headphones.
Love it.
And midway through the run, I could hear all of the birds. And I was so much more in tune with the physical environment around me. And I almost got emotional. I thought, am I missing this?
Mm.
This feels new. This probably isn't new. I'm just numb to it, or I'm not hearing it because I'm hearing some people like us talk.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we need to retrain ourselves to become attuned to the natural world, and it's a training. You need to practice that, develop the practice of it. We all do. Yeah, that's great. I love that story.
No, it was beautiful. So thank you. You talk about true leisure. How
Mm.
can true leisure save us? I mean, it sounds like you just want people to be lazy.
Here we'd have to do a little study into the history of the word leisure. And this comes from scholae in Greek and Latin, which is where we get the word school, which is sort of funny. When people think of school, they don't think of leisure, they think of like work and quantification, grades, measurement, all that. But historically, leisure was much more about what you did with your time to develop as a person, to meditate and ponder and reflect on what was true, good, and beautiful. And a free person had leisure time. The person who was liberated, free, um, could do such things with their leisure. Today, we think of leisure as like entertainment, right? Watching TV, internet, amusement parks, things like that, leisure time activities. But that's such a shallow view of leisure. So yeah, the recovery of true leisure, the developments of human capacities, and the sort of enjoyment of reality as it is, not for the sake of quantification or pragmatism or something like that. That actually is vital to recovering and reclaiming our culture. And as Joseph Pieper says in Leisure, the Basis of Culture, leisure actually is what made our culture what it is because we took seriously the permanent things and the importance of developing those human capacities that aren't utilitarian, that aren't economic.
Hey, you talk about, I think about this all of the time, entertaining ourselves to death,
Hmm.
that we're almost, because we have such consistent access to these distractions, I really do feel like we are one of the first few generations that it's not like just outright imperative that you ponder existential questions, right? Is there a God? Why am I here? I mean, I think that there are actually people that have never thought those questions. They've never attuned themselves to thinking like that. And yeah, and
Yeah, because our devices can constantly distract us, right? We never have to hear the skeletons in our closet or the voices inside our head because we can always be hearing other voices and have other music on and just constantly distract ourselves. And all the while, never confront those, as you said, existential questions that we need to. Yeah.
I remember clear as day. I was probably 6 years old, sitting in the back of my parents' minivan, staring out the window and really just thinking, "What is this? How am I here? What does all this mean?" And I worry that there's a large portion of the population that hasn't pondered the questions that were just you had to before. There are 2 words that I really, really, really loved in your book, and I don't know that they would have stuck out to everybody, but it's that thing where 2 people find something in common and, "Oh, wow." You talk about no agenda togetherness. No agenda. And those are 2 words that have been so near and dear to me for the past couple years. As I've gotten more involved in my church community,
Mhm.
they're constantly trying to put a label on everything.
Mhm.
This is a bunch of men get this is men's group. We need these are a bunch of old people. They're the young
Mhm.
at heart group and all of these different groups. And I keep thinking to myself, no, you know what we need? We need no agenda togetherness, just to be together without, well, what's the end goal? What are we going to get out of this? What's the to just I mean, is that something that you think about? Clearly it was in your book.
Of course, yeah. This again gets back to that efficiency and productivity mindset that we've just so absorbed, right? We want to be able to turn everything into a quantifiable, measurable thing. We want to put it in these nice little categories that fit with metrics and things like that. But if we're not comfortable with just being, then the new kingdom might be boring to us, right? I mean, there's gonna obviously there's gonna be things to do, but it's not gonna be like things to do for the sake of productivity or efficiency or quantification. It's going to be things to do that are of permanent value and whatnot. So yeah, that's a great thing to think about, right? How are we in our lives um, finding ways to practice togetherness that doesn't have an agenda, that isn't about what we're going to get out of this little time here or in some productivity sense, but more for the cultivation of who we are and cultivation of relationships with each other, which is something that transcends quantification and many times is very inefficient. Think about walking with somebody through depression or being at the bedside as somebody's nearing death. Those are very inefficient things. Those take time and hand to hand human care, but that's love. That's who we are. Relational beings designed for love and communion with one another and with God.
Unhurried was another word that
Yeah.
that really stuck with me as I was pondering those words in your book. No agenda, unhurried togetherness, just getting lost in conversation. I mean, I think that's when you really experience Kairos time.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, and our society is driven by Chronos time, right? The clock reigns. Chronos is a jealous god, and he was in the Greek pantheon, by the way, too. And so, yeah, ways we can recapture moments of Kairos are so vital today to sort of step out of that Chronos clock time and into these eternal moments. The church is a great place for that to occur, where we literally experience a Kairos moment as Christ comes to us in his word and in his gifts. In our homes, great times for Kairos moments where we don't have to be driven by the clock. And ideally, there can be times we're not driven by the clock at work and at school too, where we're not driven by shifts or bells, but by the actual engagement that we're having with other people and the things that we're doing.
And they say that beauty can save the world. I hate to make a false distinction here because there's beauty in hospitality. But I really started to think, I mean, you talk about bringing people into your homes and how hospitality can save the world. Do you believe that?
I do. I think that really is present in the scriptures and in the way that God saves the world. He welcomes us to his table. Jesus was all about hospitality, eating with sinners. tax collectors and prostitutes, bringing people around the table. And that paradigm obviously has all sorts of connections to the table of the Lord and the parish table and our tables in our homes. And it's very powerful. It's countercultural to welcome people into your homes and into that act of eating. Last weekend, I was at a conference in New Jersey speaking on education and technology. And in the airport, when I was waiting for my flight to get home to Charlotte, a guy sat across from me and he had a pizza. And you know what happens at the airports nowadays. Everybody's just like this, right? Nobody is interacting with each other. But he saw what I was reading and he said, "Hey brother, let's share some pizza." And so we sat, this was just such an amazing moment to me. We sat there for a half hour waiting for our flight, sharing a pizza together, right? And talking about wonderful things. We had a wonderful conversation and just made a human connection because he was willing to say, "Hey, do you want to have some of my pizza?" You know, there's something about eating together that can do that, right? It
Yes,
opens up avenues of conversation that um, don't happen otherwise. There was a Kairos moment for you, right? Right in the
that's
middle
beautiful.
of a mechanized, quantified, metric driven place like an airport, right, where everything runs by Chronos. Um, thanks to that guy for embracing Kairos and sharing his pizza with me.
And humanity, right?
Right.
I mean,
Totally.
you're a person right in front of him, and we've lost the ability
Yeah.
to I mean, you're a weirdo if you do that, and
Yes.
thank God he
Totally.
asked you because there's so many people who'd be like, "What is this creep trying to do?"
Yeah.
There's gotta be a
And you know
something,
what? It was
a
perfect
sales
because
pitch or something.
I had skipped dinner that night to get to the airport and I was hungry. And so it actually met a need too. It was just such a wonderful confluence of things. And again, he was open to that, right? He was looking around and it saw that I was there and looked at what I was reading and was like, "Hey, we could have a conversation and eat some pizza." And it was those are the types of things that give you hope.
I really believe it. I mean, my wife and I we worked really hard to try and find a home that's close to our church, that's close to the community that we're trying to develop and be really becoming rooted to because we wanted to say, "Hey, come over to our house before we live 40 minutes away."
Yeah.
That's an investment
It's
for
a
people.
challenge.
Now
Yeah.
we're 10 minutes away. Come. And it's really that hospitality driven, not for ourselves, but for the sake of our community. I mean, we really do believe that that's such an important thing to break bread together and just
Right.
be,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, and around the table, to connect back to the will save the world quote, I mean, you can engage in beautiful things. A meal can be a beautiful thing when it's well prepared. Around your table, you can have beautiful artwork. You can have beautiful discussions. You could listen to beautiful music or make beautiful music together in your home. So it's not disconnected. Hospitality and beauty aren't disconnected, that's for sure.
Josh, what happens to a culture that can't name what it sees?
You just get blindsided by whatever's coming because you're not thinking intentionally about it. And I think we're seeing that today. People just don't have the categories and the frameworks to think about what they're getting steamrolled by. And if you can't name something, then you're certainly not going to be able to resist it.
Where are we most eager to look away from reality?
Probably when it would force us to change something about ourselves, that it would cause us to confront our weaknesses and failures. I think those are probably the areas that we are blind to.
And in a world that feels increasingly unreal, what feels most real to you?
What feels most real to me as I'll give a couple things, maybe in different categories, like as a pastor, as a parent, and as a husband, maybe. As a pastor, what feels most real to me is when I have the honor and privilege of distributing the sacrament to people. And literally in my hands, in the chalice, I'm able to distribute the blood of Christ intimately to that person and have in a way share that experience with them person by person by person. That is most real to me. That's the deepest reality of the universe right there. The living resurrected body of Christ. As a parent and as a husband, what makes me feel most real is embracing my children and my wife.
Amen. I'm with you on all fronts. I mean, it's reality, right? I mean, it all comes back to the incarnate Christ. I mean, it's if If that story is true, it's everything.
That's right.
And clearly you and I believe that. One more thing. When you heard commitment to reality, what does that mean to you?
I love it. I think it's a great title. I think it's exactly what we need. And to me, it means commitment to being embodied beings, the unity of body and soul together, and that we're going to have practices and habits that help us live this out in our lives and in community with each other.
Josh Pauling, we both live in Charlotte.
Yeah,
So I
we
want
need to
to
meet
end by,
up, right?
yeah,
Have
I
an
was going to say,
embodied meal together. Let's do it.
I want to end by thanking you for joining me on a commitment to reality and putting a public proclamation out there that we've got to do this in person.
That's
Let's
right.
break bread.
All right, man.
Thank you, Josh. I
Thanks,
appreciate
Dave.
you.